The strike zone is more accurate than ever, and it's also smaller than it's ever been. Yes, that alone raises a lot of questions, many of which we'll dig into in this video. Why is the zone smaller? Did the league not tell anybody? Is catcher framing now just a mess? Are pitchers going to become command artists? Don't worry, I've thought through it all. The simplest way to look at this is through what I'll call ball strike accuracy. When you look at the strike zone, there's an area called the shadow, which is essentially one baseball on the plate and one baseball off the plate. It's an area where hitters do very little damage relative to the center of the zone, and a pitcher's ability to live there is largely connected to the kinds of pitches he throws and his command. On our list of pitchers most often living in the shadow this year, we see a pair of Yankee relievers, one good and one not so good. The 2022 version of yourself would be pretty surprised to find out Devin Williams is the not so good one. We also see two of the season's most dominant pitchers in the AL West and the king of the shadows, Kyle Hendricks. This year, if we just look at ball strike calls one ball off the plate this season, and we judge the accuracy of those pitches, there is a spike this season. Umpires are getting better at calling these pitches accurately. If we go back to 2015, umpires were wrong about a quarter of the time on these specific calls. Fast forward all the way to 2025, and umps are calling these pitches correct about 85% of the time, a 10 percentage point increase from 2025. And perhaps most notably, it jumped from about 82% to 85% between last year and this year, a pretty considerable leap in just one season. So if you're watching a baseball game, throughout that individual game, you're getting about 32 of these ball strike calls within that one ball off the plate parameter, just under one every half inning or so. If you were watching an average game in 2015, 24 of these 32 calls would be correct. In 2024, that number would jump up to 26, and in 2025, we're now looking at just over 27 of those 32 calls being correct. This started to trickle out to the public a couple weeks ago when people started noticing that called strike accuracy had changed from prior seasons. And then we saw Jason Stark and a couple other writers at The Athletic write about this very topic. I encourage you to check out that piece. It's the inspiration for this video. And what they found was that the process for grading or judging umpires had changed. Umps are evaluated by the league on what's called a buffer zone. It's an area around the zone where the ump has the ability to make a judgment call. They won't be punished if they're incorrect. I actually used to work in public accounting. It wasn't fun, shout out PwC, but we had this thing called materiality. Basically, does this discrepancy actually matter? MLB was saying, hey, in this spot of the zone, your ball strike call is immaterial to your effectiveness as an umpire. Those calls can go either way. Last year, that buffer zone was 2 inches off the plate all around the plate. And this season, as you can see from the Athletics article, really good graphic here, it's now just 3/4 of 1 inch, both inside and outside the zone on all sides. This change in the buffer zone has directly incentivized umpires to call tighter strike zones in order to be graded better, and that's why we're seeing balls off the plate within that one ball distance be called more accurately, because in the past, umpires had a bit looser of zones and those balls were often called strikes. The problem is they become so passive that what's happened is if you go one ball inside the strike zone, those pitches are being missed at a higher rate than they have in the past. Going back to our conversion into how many of these calls you actually see in a game, now looking at pitches one ball inside the strike zone on all sides, you'll get about 26 of these in total in one game. For the last 6 seasons, just over 21 of these 26 calls would be correct, and umpires were pretty consistent in this particular part of the zone. This season, however, we're only seeing 20 of these calls called correct. Again, it seems small, but think about it this way. Between 2024 and 2025, what we're talking about here is influencing 2 pitches a game. One ball that's off the plate called a strike, and one ball that's on the plate called a ball. If you spread this across the entirety of Major League Baseball, there are about 5,000 more calls this year being affected than last year. We don't know when these calls will occur in a given game, and perhaps they're unevenly distributed among umpires. Perhaps, 50% of them are maybe immaterial, but those that aren't often become the story of a given game. Now, the net of this effect is that called ball strike accuracy is higher than it's ever been, and that's how MLB is marketing this. Umpires are more accurate than ever, the zone is more accurate than ever. Technically correct, it's just that increase is very, very small. It's basically a rounding error in the math I was using to make this topic a bit easier to communicate. The more interesting thing here is that although there's not too much of a change in the overall effect on the sport, I do wonder how it's affecting other elements of the game. And one of the biggest impacts this is having is on catcher framing. Baseball Savant calls catcher framing the art of a catcher receiving a pitch in a way that makes it more likely for an umpire to call it a strike. Well, if the umpire changes his standards this dramatically, then it's going to change the evolution of this art. True Media has a stat called catcher framing runs above average. Basically, how good are you at stealing strikes over the average catcher? I'm not going to dig into how they construct this stat. There's a lot of contextualizing that needs to be done. But among catchers with at least 15 games caught this season, there are just 2 guys above average. 2. That is it. Gabriel Moreno and Drake Baldwin. Now you might wonder, well, maybe it's just a byproduct of small sample. We haven't had a ton of games yet. That's incorrect. Last season, there were 17 catchers after the first month of the season who were above average. There were 16 catchers above average after the first month in 2023 and 17 in 2022. That number has stayed pretty consistent. Now, this isn't the end of the world. Teams just need to update their internal models on how they value framing. Shout out to all those analysts in organizations who now have something extra to do that they didn't expect at the beginning of the year. It's going to jumble our public catcher evaluation as well, especially with regards to framing, and perhaps it has a small impact on who wins the Gold Glove in the AL and the NL. In the long term, I think the contraction of the strike zone is a really positive development. What I think we'll get eventually is the challenge system. I don't think we're ever going to go full robo umpires. And with that challenge system, what it allows is the catcher, the pitcher, the batter to correct any of these egregiously incorrect calls that perhaps influence things more than what I was talking about in the shadow of the strike zone. And that, I think, is going to be a big positive for the game. In spring, the league saw 52% of challenges were overturned in the challenger's favor. A pitching team challenge was more accurate than a hitting team challenge, and catchers were driving much of that advantage. Catchers overturned calls at a 56% clip, while pitchers were just at 40%. So we have a clear hierarchy of ball knowers here. Sorry, pitchers. And congratulations, catchers. Even if your framing is all messed up this season, I actually anticipate catcher value will go up even more when we start to see which catchers overturn calls for their pitchers at the highest rates. And this will be a pretty easy thing to tie direct value to, especially if you want to add in the context of given situations and see who is the most clutch catcher challenger in baseball. The story possibilities, as you can see, are endless. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We're probably a year or two off from challenges, but they'll be glorious when they're here. And another subtle effect of all this is how this will influence pitching development. As we're talking about here, these are kind of the unintended consequences that you're not really going to know until the rule is put into place or until the contraction of the strike zone is implemented. I think the initial thought by a lot of people thinking through this topic is to go, okay, smaller zone, everyone will become much more command focused. But I actually think the opposite will happen, and the league will become even more stuff driven. Driveline Baseball has been at the forefront of tracking and training command for a pretty good amount of time now, and their director of operations, Jack Lambert, posted a chart of their pitch model leaders. My favorite part of this chart was this column on the far right, missed distance. This is in inches. The average miss in baseball is somewhere around 11 to 12 inches, varies slightly based on the pitch type. But that's a lot. The plate is 17 inches wide, and now not all that miss is lateral. This distance of 12 inches or so that we're talking about is a formula combining both lateral and vertical miss elements, but my point still stands. I think the average fan continually overstates how good pitcher command is. And if the zone is smaller, even though I think we're making some strides on the training side in terms of command, I do think our strides are going to be outweighed by the incentive of pitchers to just pound middle of the zone with big stuff, even more than they ever have, because they have a smaller zone to work with. Instead of moving the ball around so much, if I'm not getting shadow calls as often, I probably have to move back towards the middle of the plate with my targets. And if I want to be as successful in the zone more, I probably have to throw harder or make my ball move more, so my stuff has to be better. Now, unfortunately, this is what the league has been trying to push against to make the game more interesting. Many of the rules in the recent years have gone against pitchers, against big stuff. So I think they have to accept their flaws here and take a more accurate zone at the expense of a further push on the pitching side towards big, massive stuff. The main thing that national media seems to have taken away from the story is that MLB failed to communicate to the MLBPA and players, coaches, front office, etc., that they were changing how umpires were graded, and it could potentially have an effect on the strike zone. Now, whether that communication actually happened, I have no idea. And it seems weird that no one really remembers it happening, or it wasn't brought up enough as a central issue that it could allow teams and coaches and players and catchers to get ahead of whatever potential changes were occurring. So I think the Athletic article that I'll link to in the video description here does a really good job breaking all this down, bringing in player perspective, etc. I think this is all something that's coming to a head after the 2026 CBA is up, and we'll get some negotiations there. We'll see how those go. This video was mainly meant to get you up to speed on the topic, bring you a little of my perspective on how it's affecting catcher framing and pitching development, etc. So I hope you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for watching.